They're coming, and there's no place to hide. Ethan Marshall muttered under his breath as he trudged through the sun-scorched dunes of the Korrath Expanse, the sand glowing like molten gold under the twin suns, each step sending tiny clouds of crystalline dust into the searing air. His black combat suit hummed softly, the built-in temperature regulator struggling to keep up with the 115-degree heat, and his pulse quickened with every whisper of wind that hinted at movement just beyond his vision, the distant shimmer of the swarm catching the sunlight in flashes that made the horizon look like it was on fire. Ethan paused atop a ridge, scanning the barren landscape with keen eyes, noticing how the shadows stretched unnaturally, folding over one another as if the ground itself was alive. And he adjusted the strap of his utility pack, checking the energy indicator on his suit's HUD, still at 68%, barely enough for what he had planned. Somewhere behind him, the soft click of his squadmate's boots on the hard-packed sand reminded him he was not entirely alone. Yet the weight of responsibility pressed on him heavier than the armor on his shoulders, and he breathed in, tasting the faint metallic tang of ozone that the wind carried, a warning signal etched into the very air. Ahead, the first hints of the swarm's approach manifested as shifting patterns of orange and bronze, glinting scales and membranous wings catching the light, moving with an eerie synchronicity that suggested intelligence beyond instinct. And Ethan squinted, noting how the edges of the formation reflected the sun in quick, jerking flashes, almost like a signal, almost like a heartbeat. He lowered himself slightly, crouching behind a ridge of jagged sandstone, the fine grains sifting between his fingers as he considered his next move, every sense stretched to its limit, listening to the wind, the faint grinding hum that came with thousands of small bodies moving in unison, the distant scrape of claws over rock, the rustle of wings brushing against one another, and he realized the danger was immediate and overwhelming. Yet there was a calm in his chest that surprised him, a steady beat in the chaos, reminding him that he had chosen to face this. That standing was a decision itself. With a quick motion, he signaled his team forward, their helmets reflecting the sunlight as they emerged cautiously from behind the rocks, their own gazes fixed on the growing shimmer of the swarm, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that retreat was not an option today. Ethan's hand hovered over the communicator, issuing quiet, precise commands that would coordinate their movement without alerting the swarm, the tiny clicks of buttons punctuating the heavy, tense air as he scanned for the safest path, mentally calculating distances, wind patterns, and the swarm's likely trajectory, feeling the pulse of the terrain beneath his boots, each vibration a subtle hint of what lay ahead. And as the first shadows of the swarm stretched closer, rustling the heat waves across the sand, Ethan tightened his grip on the harness of his utility pack, drew a deep breath, and whispered once more, not to anyone, but to himself, "We don't run. We survive." The ridge offered little cover as Ethan Marshall led his team cautiously along the narrow sand spine, the wind carrying a fine, scorching grit that stung his eyes and filled his nose with the acrid scent of heated minerals. His sensors indicated the swarm was moving faster than before, a subtle undulation of color and shadow across the dunes that hinted at their coordination and the sheer numbers he could not yet see. And Ethan adjusted his pack, checking the thermal readouts to make sure his emergency hydration system was still functional, knowing they could not afford a lapse in concentration under these conditions. Every footstep on the crystalline sand seemed to echo louder than it should, the quiet hum of distant energy readings vibrating through the soles of his boots as he calculated the angle of approach for the small outcropping ahead, a precarious shelter he hoped would give his team a momentary reprieve. As they reached the top of a small rise, Ethan crouched and scanned the horizon, noting how the sunlight caught the swarm in sharp glints, highlighting the intricate iridescent patterns on their exoskeletal wings, each flash signaling movement that he read like a code, patterns that allowed him to anticipate shifts and plan their next steps, a mental map of threat zones overlaying the barren landscape. He signaled his team to spread out, their quiet nods barely perceptible under the howl of the wind, and they advanced slowly, each member taking careful steps to avoid drawing attention, the fine grains sifting through their boots and crunching under light pressure, every sound amplified in the vast emptiness of the Korrath Expanse. Ethan paused and took a deep breath, the air hot and thin, tasting faint salt and metal as he exhaled slowly. Focusing on the small, flickering signals from the swarm that moved like a living tide, noting how the creatures reacted to light and movement, patterns he would need to exploit to keep his team safe. He adjusted the settings on his visor to enhance contrast, highlighting the edges of their wings and the subtle shifts in their positions, and in the brief seconds of clarity, he outlined a potential path that would allow them to reach the shelter while minimizing exposure, a delicate balance of speed, timing, and distance. With a quiet gesture, he directed his team, their movements synchronized, each member scanning for the faintest change in light or shadow, the rhythm of their breathing steady yet tense, a shared understanding passing silently between them as they navigated the jagged terrain. Behind him, a small drone whirred softly, its cameras feeding real-time data into Ethan's HUD, providing another layer of awareness, a moving map of potential risk and cover, and he felt a surge of determination, knowing that their survival depended on both precision and patience, the calculated steps of a human mind against a swarm that moved like instinct incarnate. As they crested the final rise before the shelter, Ethan allowed himself a brief glance at the distant shimmer of the swarm, the patterns of light and movement mesmerizing in their complexity, and he whispered under his breath, not as a command, but as a reassurance. "We are more than our fears," feeling the truth of the words resonate through the heat, the wind, and the vast, unyielding expanse. A quiet promise of resilience that would carry them through the next challenge. The shelter lay ahead like a jagged slice of shadow against the blazing dunes, and Ethan Marshall motioned for his team to pause, the soft hiss of the wind carrying fine particles of sand that caught in their suits, shimmering under the twin suns as if each grain were a tiny signal of the swarm's movements. He crouched, scanning the uneven terrain with careful precision, noting how the shadows stretched and folded in unnatural patterns, a subtle indicator that the swarm had adjusted its approach, learning from their earlier maneuvers, and he adjusted the visor settings on his helmet to enhance contrast, highlighting even the faintest flicker of color among the orange and bronze forms glinting at the horizon, a living tide that moved with uncanny coordination and anticipation, and he allowed himself a quiet moment to trace the patterns, committing them to memory, plotting a path that would allow them to cross the exposed stretch without drawing attention. Behind him, his team followed silently, their steps deliberate, the crunch of sand under their boots measured and controlled, each individual aware of the delicate balance between speed and exposure. The quiet murmurs of coordination carried over the comm system in soft, clipped tones, reinforcing the unspoken understanding that hesitation could mean separation from safety. Ethan's gaze lingered on the distant shimmer, noting subtle deviations in movement that suggested a shift in direction, and he calculated how to use the low dunes as cover, timing their advance with the rise and fall of the wind to mask the sound of their passage, while the heat radiating off the sand created mirage-like distortions that could both hide and betray their presence, a paradox he needed to exploit with precision. The team moved in careful succession, shadows merging with shadows, bodies low to the sand, muscles coiled with readiness, every sense alert to the faintest signal from the environment, a reflexive awareness that extended to the smallest vibrations in the ground, the whisper of air currents over the crystalline surfaces, the glint of sunlight. On distant scales, all feeding into Ethan's calculated decision-making as he led them across the treacherous expanse. As they approached the shelter, a natural alcove carved from jagged stone, Ethan signaled for a halt, taking a moment to scan the horizon again. The swarm's advance now a distant but visible pulse, shifting like a living ocean, and he breathed slowly, drawing in the scorching air, tasting faint metal and sand, letting the rhythm of his heartbeat sync with the tempo of the wind and the movement of the swarm. Grounding himself in the present while anticipating the next challenge, he allowed his eyes to linger on the shelter, noting the way the light played across its sharp edges, offering both concealment and vantage, and he whispered under his breath, not as a command, but as a quiet affirmation to himself and his team, "Every step counts. Every moment matters." And as the team positioned themselves within the shadows of the alcove, Ethan felt a brief surge of control, a fragile sense of preparation, knowing that the next phase would demand every ounce of awareness and courage they had cultivated under the relentless heat and the watchful, synchronized presence of the swarm advancing steadily across the dunes. The air inside the alcove was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of warm sand and mineral dust that had been baked under the twin suns, and Ethan Marshall crouched low, scanning the horizon through the tinted visor of his helmet. Noting how the shimmer of the swarm reflected across the uneven dunes in pulses that suggested both movement and hesitation, each flicker like a signal he could interpret. He adjusted the strap of his pack, feeling the subtle vibration of his communication devices humming softly as his squad mates mirrored his movements, their eyes flicking from shadow to shadow, reading every micro-shift in the landscape as if it were a map of potential danger, and the weight of their collective focus pressed against the heat and the endless expanse of sand in a tangible rhythm. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying tiny eddies of sand that twisted and danced, creating fleeting mirages that both obscured and revealed the edges of the swarm. And Ethan used the moment to signal a subtle reposition, his hand tracing a deliberate arc, the team responding instantly with synchronized steps, sliding along the dunes like shadows merging with shadows, each footfall calculated to minimize the disturbance of the fine, crystalline grains beneath them. In the brief lull, he allowed his attention to wander slightly, noting the beauty in the chaos, the glinting wings of the swarm catching the sunlight at angles that made them resemble living jewels. And he reminded himself that observation was as important as action, that understanding the patterns of the swarm would allow them to navigate the terrain safely without confrontation. The team moved steadily forward, guided by his careful timing, the low hum of their boots and the distant rush of wind forming a subtle cadence that blended with the natural vibration of the dunes. And Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction in the precision of their coordination, knowing that every calculated step brought them closer to the shelter that promised cover from both the harsh elements and the unpredictable movement of the swarm. He scanned the far horizon again, noting how light and shadow interplayed across the ridges, creating visual cues that the swarm might use to detect movement, and he adjusted his approach accordingly, leaning slightly into the wind to reduce his silhouette, his breathing measured, ears tuned to the faintest shifts in sound, and as he guided his attention that had carried them across the deadly, glimmering dunes. The interior of the alcove felt like a sanctuary against the relentless heat and shimmering glare of the dunes, and Ethan Marshall lowered himself onto the rough stone, letting his back press against the cool surface as he took a moment to observe his surroundings, the natural grooves and jagged edges of the rock providing both shelter and a sense of rhythm to the space, guiding the movements of his team as they settled beside him. The wind outside carried the soft, almost musical rustle of shifting sand across the dunes, a distant pulse that seemed to mimic the faint hum of their own equipment, and Ethan allowed himself a brief pause to breathe, tasting the dry, mineral air and letting the steady beat of his heart synchronize with the slow, deliberate movements of his squad mates as they prepared for the next stage of their journey. His eyes traced the path they had just crossed, noting the subtle shifts in color and light that the twin suns created on the undulating sand, and he calculated how these visual cues could signal the swarm's position if observed from a distance, understanding that awareness and anticipation were as critical as any physical preparation they could perform. He gestured softly to a team member, indicating a small thermal anomaly on the far ridge, a subtle sign that the movement of the swarm was beginning to converge toward them, and they adjusted their positions accordingly, moving in quiet synchrony, each step measured to minimize noise and maintain the natural blending of shadow and sunlight across the rocks, the fine sand slipping beneath their boots like water flowing through their controlled motions. Ethan's fingers hovered over the communication panel, sending brief, precise signals to coordinate subtle shifts in stance and position, while his eyes scanned the horizon for any further indication of movement. Noting the interplay of light and shadow across the swarm's shifting forms, the glint of their iridescent wings catching the sun in brief flashes, almost like sparks, and he committed each flicker to memory, building a mental map of their collective behavior. The team remained vigilant, crouched low with careful attention to each sound and vibration in the ground. The delicate balance of observation and action creating a rhythm that carried them through the suspenseful stillness. And Ethan felt the weight of responsibility as a tangible presence, pressing against the heat and the energy of the alcove, sharpening his focus and guiding each decision with clarity. As the minutes stretched, the distant shimmer of the swarm moved subtly across the horizon, the edge of their formation shifting imperceptibly with the wind, and Ethan used the opportunity to provide whispered guidance to his squad, small adjustments that would allow them to maintain cover while preparing for the eventual emergence, reinforcing the principles of patience, precision, and awareness that had sustained them thus far. He took another deep breath, the hot, dry air filling his lungs and carrying a faint metallic tang from the mineral-rich sand, and he centered himself in the moment, acknowledging both the power of the natural environment and the intelligence of the approaching swarm, knowing that their next actions would require every ounce of observation and calculated movement to navigate safely through the challenges ahead. The sun had dipped lower over the Korrath Expanse, casting long, molten shadows across the jagged dunes as Ethan Marshall adjusted his visor, tracking the subtle movements of the swarm as it began to shift in response to the cooling air, the shimmer of their iridescent wings reflecting the fading light in pulses that created an almost hypnotic pattern on the horizon. He took a steadying breath, feeling the dry, mineral-rich air fill his lungs and the faint vibration of the sand beneath his boots as though the terrain itself was alive with tension, and he shifted his weight slightly, signaling his team to prepare for the next phase of their cautious advance, each movement deliberate and measured to maintain balance and minimize noise. His eyes scanned the low ridges between the alcove and the distant outcropping, noting the way the shadows deepened as the sun sank, creating visual pockets that could serve as cover if they timed their movement precisely, and he shared brief, silent gestures with his squad mates, communicating the exact sequence in which they would move, the trust between them palpable in the quiet nods and subtle adjustments of posture. As they began to edge forward, Ethan's attention split between the shimmer of the swarm and the fine granular patterns of the sand, the way a slight disturbance would ripple outward, giving him real-time feedback on potential risks, and he felt the satisfaction of anticipation sharpen his focus, a calm determination settling over him despite the magnitude of the challenge before them. A soft hiss of wind brought shifting sand across the dunes, altering the light and briefly obscuring the shimmering patterns of the swarm, and Ethan used the moment to make a minute adjustment in their trajectory, guiding the team along a narrow, natural corridor carved by centuries of wind erosion. Each step a calculated move that kept them within the protective folds of shadow and stone. The air was hot but less oppressive than earlier, the sun's lowering enough to give a slight reprieve, and Ethan allowed himself a brief mental inventory of resources and equipment, noting hydration levels, energy reserves in the suit, and the calibration of his visor, all the while maintaining constant awareness of the subtle, synchronized movements of the swarm. A living presence that seemed to anticipate their every action. He directed the squad to pause behind a low ridge, just long enough for them to catch their breath and scan the next segment of the terrain, the quiet click of communication devices and the hiss of air vents punctuating the stillness, creating a rhythm that matched the low pulse of his heartbeat and the faint vibration through the sand, reinforcing the awareness that patience and precision were their greatest allies. And as the shadows lengthened, Ethan's eyes caught a glint of movement, a slight ripple across the edge of the swarm, and he whispered softly to himself, "Observe, adapt, advance," the words anchoring his focus, a reminder that their progress relied not on haste but on measured, deliberate action. And as he prepared to lead his team along the final stretch toward the natural alcove that promised further cover, he felt a sense of quiet control, a connection between human instinct and the vast, shifting environment that would carry them safely through the next stage of the journey. The light from the setting suns dipped lower behind the distant ridges, casting elongated shadows across the dunes, and Ethan Marshall crouched low behind the jagged stone of the alcove, his eyes sweeping over the glimmering horizon where the swarm's movement had grown more erratic, yet unmistakably deliberate. the glints of orange and bronze scales catching the fading light in patterns that seemed almost like a signal of intent. He adjusted the calibration on his visor to enhance contrast and motion detection, tracing subtle shifts in the sand and wind, noting how the smallest ripple could indicate a change in the swarm's course. And he shared a brief, silent hand signal with his squad, conveying that they would move in precise formation, each step timed to avoid drawing attention while maintaining awareness of every anomaly in the terrain. The air inside the alcove was cooler, carrying the faint scent of heated minerals from the surrounding dunes and the dry tang of sand, and Ethan allowed himself a moment to focus on his breathing, feeling the pulse of the environment through the soles of his boots as the ground vibrated gently with distant movement, a reminder that every sensation could provide information, every flicker of light or shadow a clue to survival. His team shifted slightly in response, sliding along the stone edges with coordinated precision, each member attuned to the rhythm of the terrain, the wind, and the light, moving as if part of a larger organism. Their awareness stretching beyond individual perception into a collective vigilance that Ethan could feel as a subtle resonance in the space around him. He noted the interplay of shadows and reflected light across the ridges, how the fading suns cast long, angular patterns that could serve both as concealment and hazard, and he plotted their path, timing their advance to coincide with brief moments when the wind would obscure motion and sand particles would scatter across the ground, masking their presence from the swarm's perceptive movement. The faint hum of their communication devices provided a background rhythm, the soft clicks and static punctuating the quiet tension, and Ethan relied on this network of signals to coordinate adjustments in posture, pace, and positioning without breaking the delicate silence of observation. He allowed his attention to linger momentarily on the distant shimmer of the swarm, noting how the edge undulated, like a living wave, responding instinctively to the terrain and light. And he committed the shifting forms to memory, integrating them into his mental map of the landscape to anticipate possible routes of approach and areas of relative safety. With a gentle hand gesture, he guided the team to begin a cautious crawl toward the next natural shelter, their movements measured and fluid, synchronized with subtle changes in wind and light. And as they advanced, Ethan felt the quiet satisfaction of meticulous preparation, knowing that patience, awareness, and coordinated action were as critical to their survival as any tool or device. The final stretch of exposed sand loomed ahead, and he whispered softly, more to himself than to the squad. Observe, adapt, advance, a mantra grounding his focus as the shadows deepened, the suns dipped lower, and the interplay of light and movement continued to shape the unfolding strategy that would carry them safely through the next challenge in the vast, shimmering expanse. The distant horizon glowed with the deep amber of the setting suns, and Ethan Marshall crouched low on the edge of the sandstone ridge, eyes scanning every shimmer and reflection across the dunes, noting how the subtle shifts in light could reveal even the slightest movement of the swarm far beyond their immediate view. He adjusted the visor on his helmet, enhancing contrast and detecting micro-movements in the sand that might indicate patterns of approach, while the soft hum of his suit's temperature regulators provided a quiet, consistent rhythm against the hot, mineral-rich air, allowing him to focus sharply on the interplay of shadow and light that stretched ahead. His squad moved in perfect synchrony, sliding over the jagged sand with minimal disturbance, boots barely making a sound as the wind carried away every faint whisper, and Ethan could feel the pulse of the dunes beneath him, each vibration providing subtle feedback on the terrain, the direction of the wind, and the presence of shifting masses beyond the immediate ridge, a living map of cues that guided their progress. He signaled with a subtle hand gesture to the team to shift their formation, moving along the natural contour of the ridge to maximize cover while maintaining the line of sight needed to monitor the swarm's distant shimmer, each member responding instinctively, their awareness heightened by the coordinated training that had become almost reflexive under the extreme conditions. Ethan's eyes followed the patterns of the swarm, noting how the edges of their iridescent wings caught the light in quick flashes, revealing the depth and breadth of their numbers as they moved. With a fluid, almost deliberate coordination, and he committed each detail to memory, calculating the optimal path forward to reach the next point of shelter without exposing themselves unnecessarily, while allowing a slight delay between each step to let the shifting sand mask their presence. He took a measured breath, feeling the dry, heated air fill his lungs, the faint metallic tang of the dunes lingering as a reminder of the harsh environment, and he adjusted his focus, listening to the subtle rustle of the wind and the faint hum of distant energy vibrations that could signal the swarm's changing trajectory, synchronizing his perception with the natural rhythms of the desert landscape. The team paused briefly behind a low outcropping, catching their breath and scanning the terrain ahead, each member taking a moment to observe the interplay of light and shadow, noting how the elongated forms of the dunes could provide temporary concealment and visual breaks in the line of sight. While Ethan analyzed the subtle cues in the movement of the distant swarm, predicting potential shifts in formation based on the reflective flashes and the behavior patterns observed over the previous hours. With a soft nod, he signaled the advance, leading the squad along a narrow, undulating path carved by centuries of wind erosion, timing each movement with the rise and fall of subtle sand ripples and shifts in light, ensuring their progress remained hidden while keeping the swarm within their peripheral awareness. As they moved, Ethan felt the quiet satisfaction of control, the delicate balance of patience, observation, and precision guiding each step, and he whispered under his breath, "A step calculated to avoid attracting attention while maintaining a full view of the distant shimmer of the swarm, whose synchronized, glinting forms created a mesmerizing pattern against the darkening sky." Ethan signaled for a brief pause, allowing the team to rest and recalibrate, their breathing steady but controlled, each member scanning the horizon for signs of movement, noting the interplay of light and shadow, the way the wind shifted fine sand across the ridges, subtly altering the landscape, and he used this moment to adjust the next sequence of movement, planning how to leverage every natural feature to maintain concealment and minimize risk. He traced the distant patterns of the swarm, observing how the edges expanded and contracted with almost deliberate precision, and he whispered a quiet affirmation to himself and his team, reinforcing focus and coordination as they prepared to advance. The squad moved with careful synchronization, each member attuned to the rhythm of sand, light, and the soft pulse of the environment, the dry, mineral-laden air filling their lungs and grounding them in the present as they edged closer to a larger outcropping that promised more substantial shelter and a vantage point from which they could better assess the swarm's behavior. Ethan allowed his eyes to linger briefly on the distant shimmer, noting the subtle changes in movement, the interplay of reflection and shadow, the way the swarm adjusted to unseen pressures in the terrain, and he committed these observations to memory, integrating them into a strategy that would guide the squad across the final segment of dunes. As they crept toward the outcropping, the wind shifted, carrying fine particles of sand across their path, blurring the edges of shadows and offering a fleeting advantage, and Ethan felt a controlled surge of anticipation, the careful observation, patience, and synchronization of his team combining into a single, focused rhythm that would carry them safely through this critical juncture in the expanse, the final stretch before a temporary reprieve and the next challenge of the endless, shimmering desert. The dusk had deepened into a muted twilight, the twin suns finally dipping below the horizon, leaving the dunes bathed in a soft, amber glow that reflected off the crystalline grains like scattered starlight, and Ethan Marshall crouched low behind the natural alcove, eyes scanning the horizon for subtle movements, each glint of iridescent color from the swarm signaling shifts in their formation, while the faint hiss of the wind carried the scent of heated minerals and dry sand, grounding him in the environment as he considered the next steps. He adjusted the settings on his visor, enhancing contrast and motion detection, noting the subtle patterns of shadow and reflection across the rolling dunes, and he signaled his squad mates with deliberate, measured gestures, guiding them to adjust positions in a silent, coordinated dance that allowed each member to maintain maximum awareness and cover while advancing toward the next point of temporary refuge. The team moved in careful synchrony, each step measured against the shifting sand, the slight crunch of grains beneath boots almost imperceptible against the background hum of the environment. and Ethan felt the pulse of the terrain through the soles of his boots, registering every minor dip, ridge, and ripple that could affect their progress. The delicate rhythm of movement and observation blending into a heightened state of awareness that encompassed both human instinct and environmental feedback. As they advanced, the shimmer of the swarm shifted across the distant dunes, their patterns forming almost rhythmic undulations, and Ethan studied the movement closely, anticipating the way they would respond to changes in light and terrain, adjusting his path to maintain both concealment and a clear line of sight to the approaching forms, a constant assessment of risk and opportunity guiding every decision. He paused briefly behind a low ridge to survey the area, feeling the subtle pulse of the wind carrying minute particles of sand in shifting patterns, and he adjusted the team's formation to exploit these natural effects, allowing the ambient light and movement to obscure their silhouettes while preserving awareness of the larger landscape, each member responding with silent efficiency, the cohesion of their movements reflecting both training and trust. Ethan noted the interplay of long shadows and soft reflections across the dunes, the way the fading light created pockets of both concealment and exposure, and he mentally plotted the precise timing for each subsequent step, ensuring the team would move in a way that minimized visibility while maintaining cohesion and readiness. The faint glow of the horizon provided a sense of scale and distance, reminding him of the vastness of the expanse and the potential unpredictability of the swarm's behavior, and he maintained focus, filtering out distractions while integrating the sensory information from every angle, visual, auditory, and tactile, into a comprehensive strategy. He allowed a quiet exhalation to steady his breathing, the rhythm aligning with the subtle pulse of the terrain and the distant shimmer of the swarm. And he whispered under his breath, a mantra of calm and control: observe, adapt, advance, reinforcing the precision, patience, and coordinated awareness that had guided them thus far and would continue to carry them safely across the shifting, luminous dunes into the next phase of their journey. The night had fully settled over the Korrath Expanse, the twin suns long gone below the horizon, leaving a soft, luminescent glow cast by the mineral-rich sand, and Ethan Marshall crouched in the alcove, surveying the distant shimmer of the swarm as they advanced across the dunes, their iridescent wings catching the faint ambient light in rhythmic flashes that marked their coordinated movement. He adjusted his visor, enhancing low-light contrast and motion detection, tracing the subtle undulations in the dunes that might conceal the swarm's forward edge. While the team moved with synchronized precision, each member aware of the fine balance between caution and momentum, the soft hiss of the wind carrying minute grains of sand that glimmered like stars in the ambient glow, and every detail fed into Ethan's mental map of potential hazards and opportunities for maneuver. He signaled the squad to reposition slightly, taking advantage of natural depressions and shadowed ridges to remain partially obscured, and the team responded with quiet efficiency, their movements fluid and deliberate, the subtle crunch of sand underfoot carefully modulated to prevent detection while maintaining constant awareness of the environment and the shimmer of movement in the distance. Ethan's mind raced through multiple possible paths, considering how the slope of the dunes, the reflective qualities of the sand, and the faint vibration through his boots could inform the timing of their next advance, and he issued brief, silent gestures to indicate pauses, shifts, and slight course corrections that kept the team aligned, their collective rhythm a blend of observation, anticipation, and measured action. The swarm's pattern changed slightly, the edges folding inward then extending outward with a fluid precision that suggested instinctive coordination, and Ethan noted the subtle variations, using them to predict where gaps might form, where light and shadow would create temporary concealment, and how to leverage those moments to maintain stealth and advance safely. He took a steadying breath, feeling the dry, mineral-laden air fill his lungs, and he allowed a brief moment of reflection, acknowledging the vastness of the expanse, the skill required to navigate it safely, and the importance of patience, observation, and coordination in every step they took. As the team began to move again, Ethan guided them along a shallow ridge that led toward a slightly elevated outcrop, timing their steps with the subtle shifts of wind and light to mask their presence. each member adjusting posture and pace in perfect unison, the quiet hum of their communication devices providing an additional layer of coordination without disrupting the natural sounds of the environment. The long shadows of the dunes stretched ahead, creating pockets of concealment that Ethan exploited, and he whispered softly to himself. Step by step, awareness and patience, reinforcing the focus and calm that had guided them thus far. Every glance, every shift in light, every ripple of the sand informed his strategy, and he led the team across the final stretch toward the outcrop, the subtle glow of the night sand highlighting the contours and textures of the dunes, guiding their careful advance as they prepared for the next challenge. The anticipation of the swarm's proximity heightening their senses and solidifying the rhythm of observation, anticipation, and precise movement that had carried them safely through the shifting, luminous desert. The outcrop rose ahead like a natural fortress, its jagged edges catching the faint glow of the twin moons now beginning to reflect off the mineral-laden sand, and Ethan Marshall led his squad along the final stretch with a careful, measured pace. Each step calculated to maintain balance and minimize exposure while maximizing observation of the shifting shimmer of the swarm far across the dunes. He crouched low behind a ridge for a brief moment, scanning the horizon with enhanced visor settings that highlighted minute variations in light and movement, noting how the swarm's coordinated forms undulated in response to subtle changes in terrain and ambient conditions, and he adjusted the team's spacing and posture with a slight hand motion, ensuring their alignment and readiness without drawing attention. The wind carried fine grains of sand that glowed faintly in the moonlight, dancing in eddies around the team and masking their silhouettes, and Ethan used these natural distractions to guide a slow, controlled advance toward the outcrop, the terrain beneath their boots providing subtle feedback through vibrations that informed him of small dips and ridges, each detail integrated into his mental map of the environment. The team followed with quiet precision, movements synchronized like the pulse of a single organism, eyes and ears tuned to the subtle shifts in light, shadow, and wind, while Ethan continued to track the distant shimmer of the swarm, observing the patterns of extension and contraction in the iridescent forms that revealed both scale and potential direction, and he used these observations to refine their path and timing. He allowed a brief moment to survey the progress, noting how the shadows deepened across the dunes and how the subtle changes in hue and reflection could be exploited for temporary concealment, and he shared a silent signal to the squad to adjust their angle slightly, moving along a natural contour that offered additional cover and a slightly elevated vantage, enhancing both safety and the ability to observe further movements. As they crept along, the faint pulse of the environment, the soft hum of the wind, and the shimmering reflections on the sand created a rhythm that guided their breathing, focus, and movement, the team operating with a quiet cohesion that Ethan could feel through subtle shifts in their spacing and posture. He observed the swarm's edge fold inward and extend outward in a predictable rhythm, committing each subtle cue to memory, integrating it with the features of the dunes, the ridges, and the natural alcoves that offered potential cover, preparing for the next sequence of maneuvers once they reached the outcrop. The ambient temperature had dropped slightly, the cooler air carrying a clearer scent of mineral dust and distant moisture from a rare oasis beyond the dunes, and Ethan used the moment to center himself and his team, reinforcing the mental map of hazards, opportunities, and the natural rhythms of light, wind, and sand that would guide them safely through the next phase. With a soft, deliberate gesture, he signaled the final push toward the outcrop, movements fluid and deliberate, each member sliding over the sand with minimal noise, shadows and contours of the terrain blending seamlessly with their forms, while the distant shimmer of the swarm provided both a warning and a focal point for coordinated observation, and Ethan whispered quietly to himself. Patience, awareness, precision, reinforcing the focus, discipline, and human ingenuity that had carried them through the shifting expanse and would sustain them through the challenges yet to come. The first hints of dawn stretched across the Korrath Expanse, the pale light glinting off the crystalline sand and casting long, shifting shadows across the jagged dunes, and Ethan Marshall stood at the edge of the outcrop, surveying the terrain below with a steady, deliberate gaze, noting how the patterns of light and shadow could both conceal and reveal movement. And he adjusted his visor to enhance detail, tracing subtle ripples in the sand and flickers of color that indicated the distant shimmer of the swarm beginning to retreat in response to the changing light. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of mineral dust and the whisper of wind through the ridges, and Ethan felt the pulse of the environment through his boots. The vibrations and subtle shifts in temperature providing a nuanced understanding of the terrain that allowed him to anticipate potential changes and guide his squad with precision. He signaled a slow, deliberate advance toward a nearby ridge that offered a broader vantage, each movement calculated to maintain awareness while minimizing exposure, the team following in careful unison, shadows blending with the contours of the dunes as they moved, every step measured against the shifting ambient light and the reflective patterns across the sand. And Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction in the harmony between observation, patience, and action. As they reached the ridge, he paused briefly, letting his gaze sweep across the expanse, noting how the swarm's movements had slowed, their coordinated shimmer now less urgent, and he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the stillness of the desert, the rhythm of wind, light, and terrain merging into a natural cadence that matched the careful, deliberate steps of his squad. He observed how the dunes stretched endlessly, each ridge and depression offering potential cover or exposure, and he mentally traced a path that would keep the team protected while maintaining observation of the swarm's retreat, reinforcing the principles of patience, awareness, and synchronized movement that had guided them through hours of shifting, luminous terrain. The squad adjusted position slightly, sliding along the natural folds of the sand. The soft crunch beneath boots synchronized with the subtle hum of the environment, and Ethan whispered under his breath, "A quiet affirmation of focus and control. We stand, we observe, we endure," feeling the resonance of human presence in a landscape both vast and dynamic, a testament to the persistence, ingenuity, and calm observation that had carried them through the night and into the first light of day. As the shimmer of the swarm continued to fade into the distance, Ethan allowed a deep exhalation, grounding himself in the awareness of every detail, every shift in light, temperature, and texture of the sand, the subtle interplay of natural cues reinforcing the precision and patience that had guided their journey. The team settled briefly on the ridge, eyes scanning the horizon, breaths steady and synchronized with the rhythm of the environment, and Ethan reflected on the endurance and adaptability that had carried them this far, recognizing that human awareness, observation, and composure were as vital as any equipment or strategy. And as the twin moons faded completely from the sky, the first pale streaks of sunlight touched the dunes, illuminating the human forms standing steadfast against the vast, shimmering expanse. A quiet reminder that resilience and presence in the moment were the true measures of survival and mastery in the luminous, shifting desert.